welcome everyone to this webinar. It's been tagged Growing the Digital Health Ecosystem, Technology, Policies, and their Implications. Today's webinar has been organized by Tech Hive Advisory, basically to bring awareness or attention to the digital health ecosystem, not just here in Nigeria, but in Africa as a whole. We've seen that while the adoption of digital healthcare is on the rise in most parts of the world, Africa does still seem to be lagging behind. So we have a lineup of very seasoned speakers who are here with us, and they are going to do justice to this topic. We would like to say a very big thank you to both of our speakers for making the time out to be here with us. So by way of introduction, we will be having Ms. Cynthia Antwi Dodo as our first speaker. She is a senior technology for development consultant with over 15 years of experience, who works with organizations to design and scale technology interventions for health and social impact programs. She believes that technology can be used to transform lives and bring down barriers to access and equity. She has worked with international organizations like MSF, Grameen Foundation, the World Bank, and Farm Access Foundation. And just before I hand over to Cynthia, I would like to add that if anyone has questions during the course of the presentations, you may drop them in the Q&A box and they will be attended to. So I would now like to hand over to Cynthia. You may go ahead, please.
Hi, everyone. I hope you're all keeping well and keeping safe wherever you are. My name is Cynthia Antwi, and I am a tech for development consultant. And I've been working in health and IT generally for the last 15 years, and more broadly in digital health for the last 10 or so years. It's a pleasure and an honor to be asked to make this presentation today. And I hope that my presentation will bring a lot of discourse and discussion and gist, quote unquote, as we try to navigate the emerging issues pertaining to building a digital health ecosystem. So first off, ICTs and ICT technologies can improve the quality and delivery of healthcare services around the world, especially in our context. We have a myriad of issues from the actual service provision to lack of human capital to deliver the services and so on. And so we know that technology has been acknowledged and seen to be one of the key components to alleviate those challenges. ICT-driven digital health products and services leverage technologies such as e-health records, mobile computing, AI, blockchain, big data, genomics, and so on, to deliver more personalized and coordinated care and better and faster treatments at lower costs, or so we think. Many digital health products that have already proven and available and adaptable at all have been proven to be available, adaptable at all country levels, be it at the most rural to peri-urban to regional and so on. But the global framework that marshals the resources, the expertise, strategies, and human capital to realize the true potential of digital health is only at a nascent stage. Policymakers are struggling to adapt technology to their domestic health systems, whilst at the international level, bodies are only just starting to develop principles, practices, and tools to help late adopters catch up. And so we are aware, we have the stats, and I think our colleague on the call will also make his submission as an example of the many solutions that have come up. And so as we go forward, the question then comes, what are the emerging issues in digital health? It's not only about, oh, there's this solution that can do A, B, and C, but there's so many other things that are underlying it. As you are aware, you or not, the influence of AI, blockchain, in the use of, as one of the tools to address data privacy. How do we go about that? How do we govern that? What does that even mean to us? We barely even have a implementable strategy. How are we even going to talk of blockchain or AI? Ethical transactions of health services. The transactional ability, like if we look at even health suppliers and the proliferation of e-commerce solutions to address those needs. You see a drug online, or you need a drug online, and you just go to your nearest site and you log in and you just procure that drug. There was no consultation. You don't know how many doses you need to take. There's a lot of self-prescription. How do we govern that without any structures in place? What can we use in the gap? Cybersecurity is without a doubt one of the biggest challenges that face the continent, and on two folds, not only for criminal acts, but for this appropriation or theft of intellectual property of different innovators. There's been a proliferation of, of course, we understand the 419 and the what have you, but how does that impact the solutions that we develop? Most regulators will not even have a conversation with you if your solution doesn't meet very, very strict regulations, somewhat to the detriment of the innovation you are bringing in the first place. And what happened during the COVID pandemic? We had a number of solutions that came up. And unfortunately, a lot of governments across the continent, I'm not so sure about outside, but I speak with, when I try to look around, we're not able to adopt or even, have a constructive conversation around all the multitude of e-health solutions that were coming up to address emerging concerns. How to review it, how to check that it was sound. Is it something that will actually solve the problem? How do we even procure it? How does that even affect our current infrastructure that we have? All these issues have underpinnings in policy and things that we need to be thinking about as we talk and advocate for policy. Briefly, just to set the tone, this is a rough or high level framework of what the big building blocks of a digital health ecosystem looks like. You would have your leadership and governance. And for those of you who are familiar with some of the main people working in the space, ITU has quite an extensive list of tools and toolkits that provide guidance on how to establish e-health, an e-health framework in a particular jurisdiction. And so basically what you see here are the key components of that digital ecosystem. And you'll see that there are multiple facets that are important for that. And as you see there, legislation and policy is really one of the key underpinnings. However, the journey and the process of developing those policies does not move as fast as the other pieces would need in order for it to be as effective as possible. This is another presentation, or if I want to say, put it in a different perspective, of why it's important that we need to have this conversation and several conversations with the hope to bring in key players or key decision makers as we deliberate. As you see here, this is another building block setup or structure or framework that really talks about the key aspects that of a digital health ecosystem, and where you can see just off the bat policy gaps. If I just looking at this, I can tell data stewardship, data privacy, security, workforce integrity. Do we have those? We only have data security, but we don't have anything around workforce integrity. WhatsApp being used as a case management tool in the wards. What does the policy say about that? And it's pretty much silent. Okay. When we talk about data exchange, we can barely exchange data between government ministries. How do you do exchange between people moving from place to place in a regional bloc? East Africa is one of the more progressive blocks on the continent and have been working through IGAD, the IGAD mechanism, to have these conversations, especially as they deal with a lot of refugee issues and humanitarian issues and people moving from place to place, running away from conflict or drought or whatever. And so they've been having these conversations, although not as fast as they would have hoped, but there has been a lot of movement in the last 5 years or so around quantifying what a data exchange policy between countries would look like. We also have issues of interoperability. And if there are innovators on this call, one of the biggest challenges you may face is your system interoperable? Can you give the government the data they need to be able to ensure that they have an overview of their health population? Because that's the value that they are looking for. So if your solution doesn't have the requisite API, or it wasn't designed that way, or those type of things, you do face or will face some challenges in making your solution aligned to the national or regional strategies that are in play. When we look at analytics and traceability, I think this even became more important during the pandemic. Contact tracing, how do we do that? What policies are in place or frameworks are in place to enable us to leverage on mobile technologies to find out where people move to? In some countries, such as South Korea, this was very straightforward because off the bat, everybody knows that your data is being captured by the state. It is understood that what it is going to be used for, and you can't really question them to some extent. On the continent, we also have trust issues. We don't necessarily want to trust our government with our data, even though by virtue of who they are, they do have a lot of data about us. What does that mean from a policy perspective, and what can we say, and how can we contribute to that dialogue? We also have, this other elephant in the room where data is the new oil. So a lot of organizations came up to establish organizations that collect and convert data into different types of information and analytics and those type of things. And we are still not yet sure who they were selling it to, if at all, where it is being kept. And so there are so many other conversations around this on where the data is kept and localization of data and knee-jerk reaction from the regulators on saying all data must be localized in a country, which will also affect other ones that I've talked about, where you are talking about data exchange. If you are saying data exchange, it needs to sit somewhere where the data can be exchanged. But if it's sitting at a local level, then how would that happen? And the expense and the effort that would be needed to make that happen would be a big challenge. On top of all of this, as we speak, and perhaps the reason why we are here today is building capacity. We continue to have a lack of capacity, or perhaps now it's better, I would say. I don't think it was the same 10 years ago when I first started my foray into this space. There is, and I guess maybe also that the interest of the legal fraternity in this space is very encouraging and exciting, because now we don't need to be sitting as tech people trying to figure out how to talk to regulators and talk to the legal people. And so capacity by way of continuing the discussions, continuing to identify risks and educating all stakeholders on emerging topics is very important. Tied to this is research and development. Where are the academia in this conversation? How is what they are doing impacting on policy decisions? Because policy is also generated from some level of empirical evidence. And so if there's no evidence, how will you make a policy? Yes, we can advocate, we can talk, but we will need evidence to do that. So at the end of the day, there are several areas where policy is very important, and it will require a collective effort from all parties concerned to get involved. It's not about being passive and sitting on the periphery, but being very proactive and progressive in your engagements with the government or the regulator to bring these issues to their attention, or even if it's to their attention, let's have how do we make sure we get the results that we're looking for? I just wanted to share what policies are in place or are available currently. ICT policies by their nature were not necessarily tied to any national development goal or budget in the last maybe 25 to 30 years. A lot of this work really started in the late 1990s, early 2000s, driven by the African Union, which enabled a number of countries or supported a number of countries to think through what their ICT vision would look like. And that kind of set the foundation for what you see as the AU Digital Transformation Strategy and so on and so forth. When it comes to issues of e-health specifically, that's really a mix of different times. A lot of these e-health policies came up after the introduction of these national health policies. And one of the key things that I think would be important to note is that a lot of these policies were developed as a top-down. So you have the AU or somebody at that level creating a framework which all the other countries then take up and implement. But there was no real, even at that time, there was no real input from private sector, from other stakeholders, such as the legal fraternity. They only came in when the policy was done, it had been debated in parliament, and now you are told, go and implement. And so as a result, what that has created is that you have you have a number of gaps that have been created because policies have been not only developed very slowly, but a lot of times, in most instances, the wrong people were in the room, or maybe a smaller group were in the room, if I can say it like that. So a call to action on this would be, how do we get involved? How do we take up space and start participating in those dialogues? And where are these conversations taking place? In terms of e-health policy, of the 54 countries, 44 have some e-health policy. When it comes to data privacy, 28 countries have a policy, 9 are in draft, and 48 countries on the continent have some form of IT policy. What is very challenging about this context is that a lot of these policies were developed over 10 years ago in some instances, but on the whole, 10 years. Some policies came up, they were really good. I think South Africa is the best example. Brilliant policy, very progressive, but it was never executed. And one of the biggest challenges with policy is that, yes, we can go through the headache and pushing and getting that policy out there, but then how do you execute that policy? How do you develop a roadmap from that policy? And that's where a lot of the countries faced a myriad of challenges, because you had so many pressures coming in. You had donors on one hand coming with their own agendas and priorities. You as a government have your national development policies that you are focused on, and nothing really aligned. And so what ended up happening was everything just came to a standstill. I can remember vividly when I developed a mobile telemedicine solution in Botswana. We were able to move, instead of having patients, I think Botswana has the one unique thing that it's free healthcare, it's free education, and even with the limited resources they had, they can actually transport a patient from Kazungula, which is about 1,800 kilometers at the top of the country, to Gaborone, which is the main tertiary hospital, with a driver and a nurse, and they will sit until that patient is seen by the specialist and go back at the cost of the government, which was a very expensive endeavor. And so with the telemedicine solution that we developed for the Ministry of Health, we were able to do cases, and that's the picture that you see there, for oral health, for radiology, for cervical cancer, and dermatology. And we were able to do, across the 4 specialties, we were able to push about 5,800 cases back and forth. And they were cascaded from a district hospital to the referral hospital where the specialists reside, and so on. However, even though we had the Maitlamo policy, we had the policy on electronic health, which soon came after that because they had procured a proprietary e-health system, because they had not had a discussion, or it wasn't really a priority, in quote unquote, if I can say that. Fast forward 2015, 2016, the thing was shelved. It was only in COVID where you now realize, oh yeah, there's this telemedicine thing. Where's that telemedicine thing? And I remember my colleague calling me last year, like, oh my gosh, they said we should resurrect this thing. And there you are. So, a lot of times there are other, I don't want to, exogenous or other challenges that actually impede a regulator or a government's ability to, prioritize or align. And so when you come with your advocacy or your innovation, you need to be very, very cognizant of what the key priorities are and what the agenda is in terms of the policies that are being developed. I think this is a diagram. I'm sorry I couldn't get a better representation that was a bit clearer. But essentially, this is the policy formulation framework where we talk about agenda setting, developing the policy and so on. And one of the things that I've observed is that a lot of times the agenda, we have to ask, who sets the agenda? Who comes up with this idea that we need this policy or it's coined in this way? And usually it's more from an elitist approach where you find that it's a select group of people in a technical working group who decide, oh, let's come up with a policy that does X, Y, Z, and let's involve, this person or that person. I remember when we were trying to develop the Botswana e-health policy at the time, one of the things that I kept asking about was, where was the private sector? Where are the health professions councils? Where are academia as we go through this process? And, ideally you want to carry them at the beginning so that when you now come to institutionalizing or adopting that policy, or you take it out to further consultation, you've really dotted your I's and crossed your T's. But in most cases, a lot of the times, as you've seen with one of the policies that came out in Kenya more recently, they just decided to put a tax on all electronic services, irrespective of what service you are doing, which would affect an e-health service, because usually we are doing it for a social cause. We are looking, it's not only just about the money, we are actually providing an essential service. And then also, if we look in Uganda, I think now the rule has been repealed, but they also had an on the top or over the top service charge that they were charging on all electronic services that were there. Whilst it's true that you can get some revenue, and I think M-Pesa is a very good example of the amount of money that the Kenyan government gets from us tax on that service, there's, the introduction of those taxes need to be very targeted, and where that conversation happens in the agenda setting or advocacy is very, very important. And as you continue to talk to the regulators and the different stakeholders, I think it's very important that we keep on engaging and educating these stakeholders on what are the emerging issues and why or why not certain things shouldn't happen. I think a lot of the policies that have been developed currently, we usually, I would say we've been waiting for them to do it, but at this stage where we are, it's too little too late. We really need to get a bit more proactive, and I'm using it, a bit is relative. I would say be very aggressive, but be very, very intentional in your discussions with the regulator to say, we really need this to happen and we need it now. What is it that you need? TNT? What is it that you need? A conference room? Fine, we are private sector. Let's coalesce together and let's put our heads together and work with you to make that happen, right? So I think, in as much as we talk about all the theoretical, I don't want to talk about theoretical. I just want to focus on what are the key bottlenecks to why we are where we are. Another thing also is, again, capacity. The person you're talking to, do they understand what you're talking about? And I guess the way that policies should now probably be developed, it should factor in things like having some sort of regulatory sandbox, which enables the regulator to have a feeling of what it is that you are bringing so that they can say yes or no or ask more questions or whatever. And also perhaps, having like maybe some sort of bipartisan establishment of a group that has the regulator involved, or a chair that has the regulator involved, and you, the private sector, or the legal fraternity, or the civil society, participating in these dialogues. Even over and above what I've said, one of the biggest challenges that face a number of these governments is funding. Then even when we talk, and I think if I move further, I'm actually even at the end. When we talk about funding, generally, governments per the Abuja Declaration of 2001, we were supposed to have dedicated 15% of our GDP to health expenditure. We can barely get to 6 or 7. I think the highest we got to at a point was 8 point something, and that was Botswana and I think South Africa, and close third with Ghana. But it's been very challenging, and I think underpinning this is political will. If the political establishment feel that it is necessary to make this happen, then we have to ride on that energy to move policies, development expeditiously, so that you can be able to get those policies out whilst you've got their attention. A number of countries, and the only reason why I would say at this time, from a policy perspective, this is being discussed not only at our level, but also even at the funding level, where interestingly, I came across a number of articles that said all these monies that were being collected at wherever, IMF, World Bank, Bill and Melinda Gates, wherever, technology was now being made a requirement that we need you to look at how do we use technology as a health systems strengthening tool? How is it going to be leveraged? And there's potential funding for that. So if we look, or maybe as an action item, is to actually understand what each of our countries are saying in response to this requirement, so that we can actually put ourselves together and start advocating, or if we have already started now, intensify, because there's actually money there for it. Another point of note is that policies also requires some level of funding to make it happen. So just even evaluating, implementing, revising it, adding on any other annexures and those type of things. And possibly one of the things that I know, well, I'm wondering if it exists everywhere, but is there a general fund that focuses on technology? We have road and accident fund. We have, what do you call it? In Ghana, we have the National Health Insurance Fund. We have tourism levies. But do we have a levy for ICT? Where does it sit? If the government is very keen to adopt these policies, what measures are they putting in place to be able to fund these policies? Because that's really where the challenge has been, right? So a lot of, I think there's quite a lot for us to discuss and reflect, that from the legal perspective, we need to think through, okay, when it comes to funding, what levies are there? What are the frameworks that underpin those levies? Can they be repurposed for something else? Can we create a dedicated levy for ICT? These are the type of ICT policy and its implementation. These are some of the things that, in addition to what I've said, would actually feed into our discussions moving forward. So where do we go from here? I think what is very, very, very important and is becoming increasingly crucial, we really need to build critical mass and come together as a body or as a unit So if, for example, as a professions council or the IT council or whatever it is, and really put teeth in our action, right? Or put steps in our action. Whether it's coming, again, whether it's coming from the IT part or the legal fraternity, whichever way we want to look at it, let's put our heads together and encourage the private sector to participate, because it also affects them sometimes even more adversely than the public sector. And one of the things that I was reflecting on is, would it be possible, are we big enough from the private sector perspective to self-govern as is done in the West with the big tech companies? But you will realize with the big tech companies, they are, how should I say, they work together. They don't work in isolation, right? So it's very important that we think through how we want to interact with each other. There have been exercises and presentations that have been done in collaboration. I think that's the University of Edinburgh, which was talking about public-private engagement mechanisms. If you just search for public-private engagement mechanism, there's some online training courses around that, and really gives us a framework on how to organize ourselves so that when we talk to government, we talk with one voice. Another thing I've mentioned, regulatory sandboxes. I think it is becoming more and more important, more so that there's all these emerging technologies, and sad to see the Nigerian government just shutting down cryptocurrencies just like that. I'm curious to know what happened, but these are some of the things, and I've mentioned on another talk that with regards to digital health, we are just one incident away from a total shutdown. So it's very important that we really just get our act together and put the necessary things in place. What we think is possible, let us do so. In the interest of our businesses or our professions, it does, what is it? I think it was John F. Kennedy who said, let's let it not be what the government can do for you, but what you can do for the government. This is the same spirit. If we don't take that proactive action, it will be very difficult for us in the very near future. I'm not even talking about 5 years, it's just tomorrow. We already have colonization of big tech on the continent. Local innovators are struggling because these big tech guys have come in and they are taking up space because we are not stepping up. And they've seen the loopholes and they're taking advantage of it. And it's very important that where we can use the little resources we have to get the attention of the government, let us do so. When it comes to an organization who is trying to navigate this, and I think Tech Hive Advisory have done this really well, where they've provided guidance to e-health companies on how to navigate the various instruments that are there. And I think one of the things that I didn't mention, but perhaps will come out in our next presenter, is our policies in of themselves are fragmented. There's another office doing security, data security, another one is doing privacy, another one is doing transactions, financial transactions, another one is and having to navigate all of them is quite challenging. And so one of the things that I know East Africa is doing is they've already set up a body to focus on harmonization of these regulations in a regional level, but also is working with governments to actually do that at a national level, in their respective geographies. I think it's called IYOKO, so you can also check that out. But private companies also need to have somebody, and hence the reason why we're having this call, somebody who is well versed in the current legal dispensation and the current regulations that are there, and advise on how to navigate and establish that relationship with the regulator, depending on which solution you are providing, whether it's a medical record or an online e-commerce solution or something like that. And one of the things that I would encourage tech innovators to think about as they're designing their technology is to design your tech with these policies in mind. When I say policies, the international overarching policies that we all kind of align to. So as I mentioned, WHO already has a high level one, and it's ratified, or it's in the process of being ratified at the country level. But we already are aware of GDPR. We are already aware of HIPAA. EU is working very closely with the African Union to share lessons learned from developing the GDPR, and a lot of our data privacy policies are actually really underpinned by, or supported by what they did. And so, looking at those, and perhaps it's an area of opportunity for the legal fraternity to actually vest themselves in these overarching policies at that high global level, and look at how that can cascade and be practical at a local level, so global as it were, and look at the impacts and start advocating based on what you are seeing. One last thing for me is, as we are doing this, if there are things that are unique to your context, it should be important, and it is important to advocate for your unique context. It shouldn't be that everything is coming from outside, because our context, our dynamics are very, very different. And so I am sure the next speaker will be talking more about their experience of how they've navigated what I've said, and how they've set themselves up to be able to respond to the emerging regulations where there are gaps in the policies. And so I'll be happy to take questions now or later in our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was a very insightful session. I don't think we have questions right now, but if anybody has questions for Cynthia, you can insert them into the Q&A box, and then we will attend to that. I'll now be introducing our next speaker, who is Chukwuma Okorafor. He's a lawyer with experience in corporate and commercial law, technology transactions, emerging and high growth companies, product counseling, and impact investing. He obtained his LLB from the Kwame Nkrumah University of Science and Technology, Kumasi, Ghana, and holds a Master's of Law degree in Law, Technology, and Entrepreneurship from the Cornell Law School. He has also worked on tech ecosystem projects with MasterCard, Cooley LLP, and Gunderson Detmer. Also, he is a chartered arbitrator. You're welcome, Chukwuma.
Thank you very much, Mimi, for that beautiful introduction. And thank you, Cynthia. Interestingly, I feel like we had looked at each other's slides before the conversation started. So that was very insightful, speaking from a very high level point of view. And I will just take it up from where you stopped. I'm trying to share my screen. Just give me a minute. Yeah, hold up. There we go. Okay, great. I believe my screen is on now, so I'll just jump right into it. So disclaimer, discussions and materials referenced in this event are for conversation and illustrative purposes to spark debates only and do not account for legal or professional advice, if any, in any particular situation. Just something I'm used to doing in all my presentations. About me, Mimi has done a very good job, but education, work experience, some of the things I'm affiliated with. But I currently work with Helium Health, and that's one of the health technology companies that are driving innovation on the continent in general. And I'll start by something that Cynthia really said about accessing funding and getting access to funds from international donors, and how technology is one of the essential drivers that you need to present and show that you're doing. And that's one of the things that we do at Helium Health by creating a robust suite of products that help to make healthcare more accessible and readily impressive for users and institutions, both governments and all of that. So this is what high growth companies do, because we realize that the government can't do it alone. And because of where healthcare sits in the spectrum of things as a very vital component of existence. I mean, COVID-19 has shown us that healthcare should have been priority in budgeting, in everything we had done from the get-go. So it's pushing us into where we would have been as a continent and as people 5 years or maybe 10 years from now. Having said that, one of the things that I'll do in this talk is to give very high level conversations, and then also give within the Nigerian context about what we are doing as a country, where we are, and being a tech company, how we feel about the processes that are being adopted, the policies, the regulations, and things that can be improved to help us deliver service to more people. Digital health is basically when health meets technology. That's how I like to say it. And it dates back to the adoption of electronic medical records as far back as the 90s. However, it has a very multidisciplinary um, 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 approach, which involves a lot of stakeholders, from clinicians to engineers to data management to lawyers to policymakers. And all of these stakeholders contribute their own quota in building the ecosystem. And so that's where the conversations we're going to be having today are centered around, which is the need for investment in the digital health ecosystem. Because we see that there is need for much more investment, both human capital, cash, and even just deploying much more resources in the way we think about healthcare. This is just a rough sketch of the digital landscape in Nigeria, digital health landscape in Nigeria, where as of 2016, Nigeria was Africa's largest economy and the most populous nation in Africa. But it's estimated that by 2050, Nigeria will be one of the largest economies, one of the 10 largest economies in the world. And this also brings us to a very, very interesting data as to how that the overall health status of the Nigerian population is very poor. And this is because the government's initial focus has been on primary health care using ICT, but at a very base level. But it still does not solve some of the problems that pertain to healthcare in today's world, like the realities of today's world, which include things around getting timeous data, decision making, data surveillance, and just understanding how policy can affect or improve, or what policies to make and how these policies can be evenly distributed. This does not address it. And that's what some of the things that have become of concern to us in this space. So we look at digital health in Nigeria and how investment has been. So I'll start by, there's been a lot of startup investment in Nigeria, and it suffice to say that Nigeria is being labeled by McKinsey report of 2020 as the tech capital of the continent, because of the level of traction Nigeria is getting in terms of investment. Startups are emerging every now and then. There's funding, and there's all these rounds that you hear about with relation to Nigeria, Florida Wave and all of that. Nigeria is Africa's leading investment destination. And then 2016 to 2017 was the breakout year for Nigerian healthcare companies, and where we had about almost 50 to 100 health startups, springing up left, right, and center. But what's striking is that there's still sparse funding in the space. Governments are not helping, and also institutional funding is also at a deplete. In 2017, the Nigerian fintech raised a total of almost $19.5 million, which was compared to $3.7 million raised in the healthcare space. And what this now has shown is that this was a number that we were working with, but sporadically, there's a report, Nigerian Startup Funding Report 2020, that says that Nigerian health tech startups have experienced increased funding in the year 2020. And I'm sure we all know that one of the key drivers for that was COVID-19. But we're still a far cry from fintech. The total that was raised was about $32.5 million across 7 deals, accounting for 26.8% of the total funding raised by Nigerian startups in 2020. Whereas between 2014 and 2019, McKinsey report states that fintech have raised over $600 million. So you see the numbers show that even as far back as 2019 and where health technology is today, there's still a huge gap. We're still getting a very short end of the stick for such a critical sector like healthcare. And because healthcare affects everybody, it's something that we should be thinking about within the context of our reality. Cynthia had touched on the policy cycle, but what I would just like to say on this is that for you to have an effective healthcare regime, or how you think about healthcare within your country, there has to be an enabling environment or a framework that guides healthcare and healthcare technology, as the case may be. So you have problem identification, agenda setting, policy formulation, adoption, and implementation. But within this cycle, something that I always like to say as we think about policy is that monitoring and evaluation should always work in tandem with the policy cycle. That's where you're able to appreciate what is working, what isn't working, and what can be improved. And when you get to policy implementation, which is the last end of the cycle, in quote, you experience new issues, which is one of the things that we see in the course of our work. Being in this space, we see new issues that emerge on a day-by-day basis. And so it now takes us back to problem identification. So an effective policy cycle is always adaptable and flexible in appreciating the nuances and the fact that there will be pushbacks, there'll be counterintuitive provisions in the policy that takes us back to policy and problem identification. And then we keep working it round and round because it's a continuous cycle. Now in Nigeria, the current regulatory framework has it that there's no single legal framework as it relates to the health technology sector. But there's a reliance on a series of guidelines of the traditional care areas, like the Medical and Dental Practitioners Act, Pharmaceutical Council Act, Nigeria, and National Health Act 2014. You also have legislations like the Cybercrime Act. You have legislation such as the NICSDA regulation and all of that, which are all in bits and pieces and covers just aspects of the entire cycle of healthcare technology. Yes, they already cover the orthodox. It's even bad enough that they don't do a sufficient job, but they only focus on the orthodox healthcare service providers. But there's the National ICT Strategic Framework, which has been created. And although with policy gaps, there's the NICSDA, Ministry of Health and Ministry of Communications, which have begun to work on a policy document for digital health. And I implore that entrepreneurs should also put an eye on this, as it's really going to impact where healthcare technology is going in Nigeria. So there's a bill that is called the Electronic Health Records, National Electronic Health Records Bill 2019, which is currently before the House of Representatives. These are all steps that Nigeria is making in terms of driving digital healthcare and healthcare technology as far as, our context provides. Because Nigeria being where it sits in as the tech capital in Africa, there's a lot of eyes on us, and whatever we do tends to influence and impact how the neighboring countries think about healthcare technology within their space. Now, there's this fantastic bill, but the bill has a very, very, a very, very very rich, wording, text, everything is rich and all, but it refuses to address the complex processing of health records within the context of emerging technology. So things around big data, things around artificial intelligence, things around predictive medicine. These are not sufficiently covered in the bill. And what this does is that you have a legislation that seems to address an issue, but the real issues that come with healthcare technology is still not addressed. And you then take us back to the drawing board. Although it's still a bill, it hasn't been passed into law. There's need for all stakeholders to get on this, to be able to drive an effective legal regime. There's also a gap in the coordination of the national policy and all of that, just to make it an act that will be binding and provide a framework for how we think about it. Down here is just a summary review of the bill, that talks about some of the key provisions of the bill. Now, we have identified shortcomings of the bill, which are there are three of them. One is on data protection, one is on basically administrative functions of the board, and then the other one is blot areas. But I'll focus on data protection and the blot areas for the purpose of this conversation. There's a section called Section 13 that is not so specific on the data protection obligation on stakeholders. There's also the failure to impose sufficient guidelines and safeguards for the protection of health data. And there's also the non-mandatory requirement to comply to data protection law or operationalize an efficient privacy program. So how this impacts our work is that we then have to, because we understand how important and how vital this is, we have to rely on contractual obligations as when we are engaging facilities or healthcare providers that are within our reach. And then there's also the blot areas, which one of them is there's lack of a definition of what electronic health records really means. There's also the provision, which is more legal, that provides that pre-action notice must be served on the health record system. Now, this is tricky for us because that's not a legal person in law, so we don't really know how we hope to tackle that. But the bill, it's still a bill. There's still deliberations going on. And I think that by the time it gets to the Senate, there will be much more improvement in how we think about or how the legislators anticipated this bit. So now is the time. Now is the time more than ever before for pioneer healthcare providers to play an active hand with regulators towards framing the policy guidelines for the health technology industry. And it's important that Cynthia emphasized this a lot. And being someone that has worked with regulators over time, I always say that regulators always fight what they don't understand. And this is the problem that fintech is having. And we are not so far from getting where fintech in Africa is in terms of governments putting a complete shutdown on their operation or challenging what they're doing, or just doing things in a very, very abrupt manner that impacts their operation. And where it gets tricky for us is because we are in a very critical space, because healthcare is something that is very, 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 it cuts across. So you can't really say that, I mean, money is, but healthcare it affects everybody, from the people in the upper echelon to the people at the way bottom of the spectrum. So there's a need for, it's not just to encourage investment in terms of to foster policy. There's also a need for formation of regulation that will also encourage investors and to post confidence in the digital health market in Nigeria. And I always insist on investments, because the government cannot do it alone. Nigeria's budget on healthcare alone will be very shocking to you. And I'm sure it's the same for most other African countries. And so that's why we have to rely on this funding. But the challenge now comes to, when the funding comes, how is it secured? What are the remedies for breach? How do we think about the policy framework, the guidelines? How do you think about it? So there needs to be that enabling environment, which I'll talk about in a lot more detail progressively. Now, this is something that we always brood about in my company, about what the lack of investment in digital health in digital health sums up to. And number one is zero access to healthcare. So imagine a world where we're permanently in a COVID-19 pandemic, where in-person visits to hospitals were stopped and all of that. And we have to rely on things like telemedicine to get access to gain access to healthcare. Where you don't have the right framework, or there's no investment in that space, you leave people really, really helpless. And that in itself can even account for more deaths than even the disease itself that is, being diagnosed. There's also the lack of adequate data. So the lack of adequate and timeous data affects the efficiency in healthcare delivery as well as planning. Now, this is very, very evident on our continent, where data is fragmented. I'm happy that Cynthia mentioned it. There's one here, there is one there. There is, in Nigeria, we have the NITDA regulations regulating data. We have the Electronic Health Records Bill on one hand. You have the Health Act one hand, but there's no synergy. And what it does is that you have fragmented outcomes that affect planning as well as healthcare delivery. There's also the non-development of innovative products. So beyond having AMR, there are other components of the value chain that needs to be paid attention to. Payment processing, there's telemedicine, there's funding for even healthcare facilities that want to carry out digital health operations, because these things are not cheap. And so when you think about it from the financial perspective, there's also need for much more product suites to be built to enable the effective delivery of an accessibility of digital health. There's also the lack of planning. So government cannot adequately conduct disease surveillance. So we have we're in a pandemic right now, and you have people who don't even trust the numbers that the various CDCs in the various countries are giving out in terms of the death rate, in terms of the recovery rates and all of that. And all of these accounts for the low investment in digital health. And so there's no ability to plan on the arm of government. Then, of course, there's also the poor policy making. So when you do not even know what the critical mass, or have an integrated database of what the health records within your jurisdiction is, you don't really know what you're even legislating about. And if you recall the policy cycle that we talked about earlier, it talks about problem identification. When you're not able to identify what the exact problem is, you're not able to write policy on it. And that's one thing that we need to do better in as we think about creating frameworks, particularly in the healthcare space. There's also, of course, low productivity. So healthcare workers are saddled with manual records and all of that. Every 16 that has been mentioned here right now can be resolved to a very large extent when there is sufficient investment in digital health. And what is more, digital health is a booming area when you think about it from a lucrative perspective in terms of business. So it's something that people should start thinking about. Entrepreneurs, innovators should start looking at how to break into this space, to ensure that the more the merrier, and people can be able to do much more than what we are doing now for easy access. And then we have recommendations. And when I was thinking about this talk, I was saying that one of the things that we should think about as a country, and as Nigeria, is the immediate passage of the Electronic Health Records Bill by engaging with relevant stakeholders who are building products. And for me, it's very important that beyond the passage of the bill, there needs to be that engagement. And when I think about engagement, I think about it from the lens of a more inclusive and a more representative sort of engagement. So people within every strata are able to lend their voice and give their perspective. Because like I said earlier on, healthcare is not something that is in isolation. It cuts across gender, cuts across race, cuts across religion, cuts across ethnicity. So there's also that need to have a very, very inclusive stakeholder engagement to get a much more accurate data set that will help in driving policy and as we think about regulations in the healthcare space. And venture capital, beyond government involvement, there's also need for venture capital funding because government cannot do it alone. But when you have like PPPs and private-public partnerships, when you have things like investors coming into the space, like we have seen in Nigeria and in other jurisdictions where there's a lot of funding for healthcare, it would also help to drive, some of the things that we have identified today. Cynthia made mention of a regulatory sandbox model. It's worked perfectly well in Europe when you talk about fintech. But I also think that across anything that has like big tech, AI, that has that high level engagement in terms of relationship with big data, there is need for us to think about adopting a regulatory sandbox model. And what it does is that you basically just test the interactions between all stakeholders. And because of the sort of technology that is aggregated when you think about healthcare on the continent, there is that need to ensure that you understand before you regulate. Because when you regulate and then understand, you would have put the cart before the horse, and the problems that can arise for that from that sort of approach are really grave. Then another thing that I think about as we think about the need for investment in digital healthcare is the creation of an effective dispute resolution mechanism by making our judicial regime a lot more friendly and attractive to investors. So when people come, like in the US, for instance, you have the HIPAA. There is already that framework that provides how how healthcare information is processed, is thought about. There's also a thinking that when you bring it within our context, you have to also train judges, you have to train people who are going to be dealing with smart contracts, click wrap agreements, how to think about it. There's also need for that understanding of our judiciary. And I'll tell you why, because there's a what you might call it now, there's a digital divide that exists today. So the way my parents would think about technology or accept technology is not how I relate with technology. It's also not how the people who are coming after me are going to relate with technology. So there's need for that, constant, I'll call it sort of an engagement, but in this context for the judiciary, because I mean, if you're going to be entering partnerships with big companies, for the deployment of technology in the healthcare technology space, there's also need for you to know that there's an effective dispute resolution mechanism in place. Also, when you're doing the country's budget, there's also need for provision for healthcare. We understand that the government cannot do it alone, and that's why companies like ours have decided to take a part of the pie and solve. But even if we're taking a part of the pie to solve, where we do not have the cooperation or the good handshake or the goodwill handshake with the regulators or the government of the day, it still takes us back to not having anything at all. We can talk about how exciting and how great our product is, which they are, but we are just walking on eggshells because you don't really know how the government feels about this new wave and technology. And then there's also the need for continuous engagement with stakeholders to ensure that healthcare delivered is trusted and tried. And because where there's that lack of trust or where there's that lack of belief in the quality of healthcare that is delivered, you can't even be talking about, oh, there's now a technology element to the whole shindig. So from all of this, we can see that the potentials in the healthcare technology space are limitless. They're really, really boundless. And I hope that from these conversations that we've had, people can now start thinking about ways that they can contribute their own quota. Cynthia mentioned the academia as well. There's lack of, research and not a lot of work that you can point to on how even Africa and the continent generally feels or is thinking about healthcare and, just driving, because technology is really, really at a very fast pace. And years from now, we will not be having this sort of conversations we're having when it comes to technology, but we might still be having this sort of conversations we're having when it comes to policy. And so I would also note that academia also has a role to play. Tech Hive does a very fantastic job in terms of driving how these policies are shaped, how they are expounded on, how they're explained, how the respective parliaments and national assemblies, as the case may be, relates to healthcare technology policy. Because this is very, very pivotal, and we are really sitting on a ticking time bomb, and we don't know the day it's going to explode. We are one case away, like Cynthia said, from a total shutdown. But I would like to end and summarize by saying, I think I'm almost done now. It's supposed to be, say that the continued involvement of everyone, contributing, academia, the judiciary, policymakers, policy engagers, entrepreneurs, investors alike, it forms, everybody contributing their own quota forms a critical aspect when we talk about investment in healthcare technology. Yeah, that's that. And as I believe that, we all reflect on some of these things, and it will make room and spark much more conversations on a very broad scale. Thank you very much for listening. Yeah.
Thank you, Chukuma. Thank you for doing justice to that, to the need for investment in the digital health ecosystem. That was very, very interesting. I think we have one question here. So, okay, I'll just read out the question. Beyond funding and multi-stakeholder engagement, is the disconnection between government and private sectors on how these laws and policies are identified. Sorry. Okay, sorry. Beyond funding and multi-stakeholder engagement is the disconnection between government and private sectors on how these laws and policies are identified, developed, and implemented. What do you think can improve government and private sector engagement within the health sector in policy formulations? So the person did not direct the question to anyone. So I
I
guess
can give it
either
a
you or
go.
Cynthia. Okay, okay.
Yeah, I
Thank you.
can give it a go.
Yeah.
So when you talk about, or when you speak to how government can improve government and private sector engagement, it's one of two things. Any government that doesn't see healthcare as a priority will be having a conversation around why should we even fund? Why should we even engage? Why should we, how should we make policies? So there has to be that drive. And that's what COVID-19 has done. It has made much more people, and much more people with the political will see the need for healthcare. But we have where I don't know how it is within the context of the African continent, whereby a problem has to happen first before we move or take action, which is something that we also always need to think of. But it has to be that prioritization, because it's not really just about funding. It's about the political will. It's about making it a priority. It's about that focus on healthcare. And when you do that, you'll be open to having conversations, because you might know things from a silo point of view, but there are people who are very much more versed, much more exposed, much more experienced by their interactions and exposure, who you need to involve in terms of creating and crafting this policy. Like being in the private sector, for instance, our experience is very different in terms of how patients react, how facilities react, how medical doctors react. Our perspective is very different. But without this knowledge, or without the involvement or collaboration with private sector, for instance, and the government is just in their high horse making policies that affect these end users, there's always going to be that disconnect. So for me, I would just say that it's just a matter of prioritization and knowing that this is very important. This is a focal point. This is what we should be thinking about. Because by the time the executive thinks of it that way, the legislature will fall in line, the judiciary also will fall in line. And that's the only way you can have an effective regime when it comes to engagement. If Cynthia
Thank
has any
you.
other thing to add, maybe to also give some.
Yes,
Yes.
thanks. Yes, I think you've touched on the main issues. At the same time, one of the things I've seen is too many fragmented voices from the different areas of concern. I keep on going back to this because there is a tendency that a belief anyway, in some quarters, that if we talk together about what we are doing, it's like somehow, somewhere he's going to steal my idea, therefore. And so everybody is suffering in silence in their own little corners. And so for me, I've made it a very conscientious point that even as a private citizen, or even as I do my work, or even interact with the private sector, I always encourage further discourse and dialogue amongst private sectors people. I haven't seen, maybe in Nigeria it's more popular, where you have places where people of like minds who are focused on digital health, for example, meet. In Southern Africa, we borrowed something there called Mobile Mondays, which used to happen in Uganda. And every Monday at a particular bar at a certain time, everybody comes, whether they are alcoholics or not. They will all congregate there and discuss the emerging issues. And from there, you will find not only are you learning from each other, you are also coming up with ways, or thinking through ways in which you could work together to actually push a particular agenda. The only way government listens is if you build enough critical mass. I cannot emphasize that. The only reason why governments come to a standstill when the doctors complain or the nurses complain is because the association has said we are going on strike. They didn't say one individual. So I think it's very important as we go forward, even if through the bar associations and through the different groupings, put yourselves together and say, we are forming a group that's focused on digital health regulation and policy. And you have the mandate to do X, Y, Z and represent us in X, Y, Z discussion. Thank you.
And also just to also chime in, collaboration is what breeds innovation. When you go to places like Silicon Valley and you see even the workspace or the environment in which, innovators working, it's everybody pulling their weight, bringing in their ideas, bringing in their knowledge. So I totally agree with Cynthia. There needs to be that aggregation of collaborative efforts in driving engagement, because when you don't do that, you end up stifling innovation, because it's all a value chain. So we provide AMRO, we have a telemedicine platform, but who is talking about things around HMO claims? Who is talking about things around, all the other facets of the healthcare? Who's talking about the whole facet of the healthcare spectrum? So this is very, very important when you think about the fact that everybody's quota, everybody that is involved in healthcare technology has a seat on the table, and that collaboration is really what's going to drive innovation at the end of the day.
Thank you both. We have another question. It says, how do we create this engagement platform going forward in order to drive the government towards the direction from the private sector? Yeah, that's the question. I don't know. If Chukwuma would like to.
I can take it. I can start that part.
Okay.
We have to find the shortest, fastest, most effective way of going about it. If you are in the legal fraternity, you have a bar association. Is it a good idea to establish a group on digital health regulation and policy? Can it be supported and endorsed by the entire body of the bar association, for example? And that will give you the authority and the mandate to be able to now coalesce everybody who you need to start having those discussions. So you have to just look around you and figure out what's the fastest possible way. I'm in tech. I sit between maybe the allied health professions and tech organizations. So probably if there's a tech group that has policy as one of its mandates, I would definitely align my interests to that and push the discussion. The steps of policy making are so broad yet so narrow. So agenda setting, this is where agenda setting becomes really, really key. How do we set the tone of the discussions, and how do we get the ears and eyes of those authorities? And my suggestion for now, instead of working to establish something that will take too long to get recognition, can we leverage on what is existing to push those advocacy points? Thanks.
Thank you, Cynthia. I've got another one for you. So, someone asked, we've seen some countries adopt a national health record policy. What benefit does it hold for us, and how do we ensure that we don't run into a risk where we have a national data breach affecting health data, as we've seen in Brazil and Singapore?
Could you repeat the question again? Sorry, you broke up.
Okay. We've seen some countries adopt a national health record policy. What benefit does it hold for us, and how do we ensure we don't run into a risk where we have a national data breach affecting health data, as we've seen in Brazil and Singapore?
Okay. The biggest benefit of having a national health record, for me as a citizen in any case, and I'll give you an interesting situation. In Ghana, if you go to private health facilities and most of the public health facilities, it's very difficult to get access to your private data. It's almost impossible. You have to have running battles and threats and screaming all the way to the CEO's office until you get your file, if at all. Or you give the registrar, something for lunch and you collect your file. That's the current status of affairs. But if the data was somewhere where, irrespective of which facility that I go to, you will be able to know my medical history. At the time of an emergency, this is even very critical, where if you are incapacitated, you can't tell them, oh, I have this condition or that condition. They will have access to that information for them to make a clinical diagnosis or whatever. So that is really why we are saying what we are saying, over and above the other benefits that you will get. Okay. Now, data breach is inevitable. I'm sorry to say it, but it is inevitable. The point, or the where you need to be ready, or what you need to have, is have a very progressive approach to cybersecurity and data protection and all those other security frameworks that you have. And to Chukwuma's point, if you don't have adequate funding, we don't know why those breaches occurred. And in a previous talk that I was listening to, there are countries who have divisions within their armies dedicated to hacking systems. All they do from 9 to 5 is hack your system. So if you are sitting here on the continent and you don't have, the last time you upgraded your firewall was 2017, how on earth do you expect to be fully compliant and those things? But the truth of the matter is that as we stand now, national public health systems, especially what is sitting in the government, to be honest, we don't know what is there. We are only relying on the African cliche statement, but for the grace of God, right? So at the same, we need to be very proactive. My advice is you need to be very proactive. You need to have your risk mitigation strategies in place, and you need to have the adequate resourcing to be able to enable you to respond to whatever threat is there. The threat is not static, it is constant. It happens all the time, and it gets worse and worse as the systems become more sophisticated. Thanks.
Thank you, Cynthia. So, Chituma, this next question is directed to you. It says, from your presentation, you mentioned that there has been more funding for the fintech sector than the health tech sector. What do you think these issues are, and how can the health tech solve these issues to attract more funding?
Great. Thank you, Moses, for that. It still boils down to something that Cynthia and we said earlier on, which is, so what I see are the issues. One person trying to do everything. As opposed to fintech, that there are tech companies that just focus on APIs. All they do is provide the interface for other people to build on. There are also people that focus on mobile payments, and they just stay there. There are others that rely on the APIs too. So there's a lot of collaborative efforts within the fintech value chain that I don't see a lot in the healthcare technology space. So you have different companies who are doing the same thing. I recall that one of the things that we see from our lens when we go to sell our AMR or market our software to people is that, they're like, we already have ours. But I'm thinking to myself that with the amount of maybe access to funding we have, the amount of resource, even human capital resource that we have access to at Helium Health, if I were you, I'll be like, okay, can we see how we can leverage and work together? But that lack of synergy, that lack of, it's really fascinating to see. One of the things that you will see in fintech is that for the ones that are processing COVID-19 payments, for instance, maybe a Flutterwave might be providing the API. Paystack may be providing the payment processing. This other one may be providing the software documentation. So in that way, everybody gets a percentage. Maybe if you're looking at in terms of what the outcome for revenue will be, if you get like 2%, 0.5%, but everybody is benefiting within the value chain, contributing value in the same space, as opposed to one person trying to do everything at the same time. It doesn't always help. So there's that need for that collaboration to see, like, we're in healthcare technology. Okay, if Helium Health is doing this, what feature does Helium Health not have that I as an entrepreneur or as an innovator can assist with? It may be resolving claims for HMOs, for instance, or things around maybe vaccines, and you say, okay, let's see how we can establish a partnership and probably work together. That collaborative approach is what helps to drive growth and scale. But even when investors see that you're probably solving the same problem that Mr. B is solving, there's a lot of reluctance to, even drive fund and provide funding. And even when you're trying to engage at a policy level, all of you are saying different things. And the government or the regulators are not able to categorically appreciate what the dynamism is in your product, which is one of the issues that most fintech companies or crypto-centric companies are dealing with their engagement with regulators. Because it's like, how is this different from what the other person is doing,
I also wanted to add that just generally, most countries don't have a national data architecture.
Exactly.
With fintech, you find that they already have the lay of the land done. It's been done. The banks have built the foundation on which all financial transactions take place. And fintech is amplifying that. In health, we don't have that. So I completely agree with you that we have this mentality of he has an EMR, I have an EMR, let's see who will go first. That is really counterproductive. We need to build a value chain or a value ecosystem where each player is feeding each other. One thing I picked from another conversation is everybody, Bill Gates, everybody, all these guys, WhatsApp and all those, all have shares in Facebook. Jeff Bezos has shares in Facebook. Do we have the same culture on the continent? I don't think so. In fact, I highly doubt. Maybe in East Africa, where it's starting to emerge, but as far as what I see from the West African and Southern African perspective, less so. So the call to action is for us to bring down our own barriers and get away or out of our own way to enable us to be able to respond and actively advocate for whatever it is we need from the regulator. Thanks.
And it will also be a good point to mention that there's this famous African proverb. I don't know if, Cynthia, you've heard it before. Together we go, alone you go somewhere, and then together we go farther. I think that's the way. So just emphasizing the need for collaboration, just what I'm trying to say. Thank you.
Thank you both. Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Chukuma. I think we've exhausted the questions right now. So I'd just like to say thank you for your presentations. They were very, very informative. I think the most important thing is for various stakeholders to just play their part and to ensure that we have an effective regime. So thank you both for making the time out to be here with us. And thank you everybody for joining this webinar. We hope you have had an enjoyable learning moment, and we wish you all a lovely day. Thank you all very much.
Thanks for having us, Tech Hive. Till we meet again. Bye.